Good afternoon. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the second in the Menard Family Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm really excited today to be joined by Dr. Edward Glaeser from Harvard University, who is probably the world's leading expert in understanding the role of location and location-specific policy in influencing economic growth and economic opportunity. The title of his presentation today will be Pandemics and Geography. How does COVID-19 change America's spatial economy? And we have over 300 people that are registered today, so I'm really excited about that. And I invite you at the very end, we'll have time for questions from the audience. So please submit your questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom. Edward Glaeser is a Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1992. He regularly teaches microeconomic theory and occasionally urban and public economics. He has served as director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. He has published dozens of papers on cities, economic growth, law, and economics. In particular, his work is focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of idea transmission. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1992, and he has also written several books, including his most recent book, Triumph of the City, a New York Times bestseller. And I'd like to say that his bio is very humble. On his website, he says dozens of articles have been published, but it's well over 100, so he's published a lot. And I'd like to thank the Menard family and all of our donors for making this presentation possible and for making the entire Menard Family Distinguished Speaker Series possible. And so without any further delay, I'd like to introduce Dr. Edward Glaeser and welcome Ed. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your kind words, and thank you for all of you who have given me your time here today. And obviously, I'm also grateful to the Menard family and to the Challey Institute for hosting me. I'm going to have a presentation that really has two clear parts. The first is going to be about the evolution of America's economic geography, and particularly the geography of joblessness in the years before 2020. And then the second half is going to be focused on what COVID-19 and the aftermath means for our world, for our economic geography. So let me pull up my my PowerPoint. And I want to start slideshow from beginning. I want to start by just reminding everyone of something that I consider to be America's largest pre-COVID-19 social problem, which is the decline of male employment. When I was born in 1967, only 5% of prime-age men were jobless. For most of the past decade, more than 15% of prime-age men have been jobless. That's a tripling of that number. And that does not show up primarily in the form of unemployment, which is the number that you typically hear. Those are people who are actively looking for work. It shows up in the decline in male labor force participation. So, and you can see that here from having in the 1950s, well north of 96% of men who were labor force participants, down to under 90% or even under 88% briefly, who were labor force participants. The difference, of course, between labor force participation and unemployment is actually better, because it means that you're actually still looking for a job. If you've left the labor force entirely and you're a prime-age man, it means that you've given up entirely. And prime age, of course, is defined as being aged between 25 and 54, which is, needless to say, a definition with which I increasingly take offense as I near my 54th birthday in May. So this shows the share of the population that is not working. And I'm going to focus on men for a number of reasons, mostly because when women are not in the labor force, they're usually doing something quite productive. They're taking care of their families, they're taking care of their children, they're taking care of their parents. They're not miserable. Whereas when men leave the labor force, they're generally doing very little of anything that will look like social value to you, and the general.
I'm sorry about that, but my house just lost power. So I'm on my phone. Hopefully I won't lose power. Hopefully we'll get power quickly, but let's keep on going. Okay. So I'm trying to figure out how to make this work. We should be looking at the rise of non-employed males in the US. And what you can see on this graph is the increase in both the total not working rate, which increases from about 10% in 1980 to almost 20% at its peak, but the increase in the long-term not working rate. So this is the share of population that has been out of a job, that has been not working among prime-age males for more than a year. And that has essentially doubled between 1980 and the 20-teens. So that is really a very substantial difference. Now, I was raised in a view that the US had people who worked and Europe didn't. In fact, I wrote papers with my recently deceased colleague, Alberto Alesina, about why employment was so much more common in the US. But as you can see, that really is something of a mistake when you look at it. So today, the US falls at the bottom of these sets of countries in terms of the male employment to population ratio. We're below Australia, but below France, below United Kingdom, below Canada, below Germany. Now, we would still be north of Southern European countries like Italy or Spain, but that isn't typically what we think of as our peer countries. This shows the tremendous gaps by education. And of course, education is the bedrock on which individual and local and national success rests. So skills really are destiny in so many ways. Did you go to the next slide? Are we looking at education? Oh, no, you need to, sorry, you need to show the slides.
Hi, Ed. We're pulling up the slides right now.
Okay, great. Great, I'm sorry. So I'm talking about, right, because I don't have access to the slides on my phone.
All right, are we seeing the slides?
We're seeing the slides. Let's start from the beginning.
All right.
And again, I apologize about this. I have no idea why we've lost power, but I've totally lost power here. Okay, keep on going back to the beginning.
This is the first slide we have, Ed.
Okay, what's the second slide? Oh boy. You don't have any slides with Heartland on it?
We do not.
All right. Let's pivot on this. Okay, let's go to the first slide then. Thanks. Just go to the first slide and I'll talk it through. All right. So the rise of not working, and indeed, you know, the slides that I was meaning to show you are ones in which we documented the tremendous gaps across education, but there are also tremendous gaps across place. And as you can see, there are parts of America, both in the Southwest and in the Eastern Heartland, where more than 1 in 4 prime-age males are jobless. Right, and then there are other areas, including both coastal America and in the center of America, the area that we call the Western Heartland, the area that includes North Dakota, where in fact joblessness is much rarer. The job market is much healthier. The situation is much less dire. And in some sense, you really don't want to think about there as being a dichotomy between a coastal America and a flyover America. That's a ridiculous simplification. That America is really best seen as being divided in between a quite healthy American West, at least along this dimension, and a quite unhealthy American Eastern Heartland, which again starts down in Mississippi and Louisiana, runs up through Appalachia, and then ends in the cities of the Rust Belt. This map would look very different if I looked at this for women. For women, instead of a pattern that looks like this, you would see really much more of a north-south divide, where it's the South that has a much lower level of female labor force participation. Labor force participation and employment for men is deeply correlated with the level of life satisfaction, the level of misery. So if you look at those people who are employed and earning more than $50,000 a year, only about 2% of them have low levels of life satisfaction. If you switch to those people earning less than $35,000, you get up to about 8% have low satisfaction. You leap to those who are not working, it's close to 20% who are unsatisfied with their lives. And then if they're both not working and living alone, it's more like 30% of them are unsatisfied with their lives. And it reminds you that a sense of purpose in life, a sense of well-being in life is not driven just or primarily by your income at all. And a job is not just about your income on itself. A job is a sense of purpose, and a job is a sense of social connection. And when you look at long-run joblessness in the US, it really is very much about a sort of formation of despair that's associated with being disconnected from the larger economy. We don't have data at the individual level linking the joblessness with opioids that's that compelling, but at the place level, it also seems clear that Eastern heartland, that dark area that you're looking at, is really the area that is the epicenter of the American opioid crisis. In some sense, the connection between opioids and the joblessness is related to the fact that these men just have too much time on their hands. And it's amazing when you look at the time use surveys, when you look at women who are related to, when you look at women who are engaged in this, you see that they are often doing things that are highly socially productive. By contrast, right, the men who are doing this are typically spending 5 hours a day watching television. And it's really a totally different thing. Now, it's useful, I think, to look at America as being the sort of time pass of these three different American heartlands. And I'm going to define these three heartlands, and I'm about to get my own slide deck working, I believe, because my power has just come back on. The three different heartlands, which are defined by whether or not you entered into the Union before or after 1840. So that's how we're going to define this. When we do this, we can then look at the path of joblessness in the three regions. And in these three regions, it's the Western heartland. It's these states, and you can see this clearly in the map. It's states like the Dakotas that have the lowest levels of male joblessness that are doing the best on this. The coastal states lie between, and then the states of the Eastern heartland are in the worst shape. So that's our third level of this. When you look at GDP over the last 50 years, the Eastern heartland is the primary laggard. It is the area that has done far worse than the other two regions, which are both doing quite well. But the growth of the Western heartland and the growth of the Eastern heartland are fundamentally different, because the Eastern heartland's growth, the growth of the Western heartland and the growth of the coast is fundamentally different, because the growth of the coast is associated with increasing GDP per capita. The growth in the Western heartland is associated with growth in the number of people. And that's partially related to the fact that our coastal cities have made it much more difficult to build than the cities, than the places in the interior. And that fundamentally makes makes this boom different, and makes our spatial policies different. Okay, I'm going to join with this. I'm back on my. Okay, we're back on the computer, and can I get back my capacity to share my own screen? Okay, so great. Sorry about that. I apologize. This is the drug poisoning fatalities that I said about. This is the 5 hours a day that men in the Eastern heartland who are jobless are spending watching television. But you can see that computer gaming is coming to eat in a little bit of that. So there's an extra half an hour a day of computer gaming that's going on. And that's really where all the time goes. This is our Eastern Western heartland. This is the gap in joblessness between these three regions of the country. And as you can see, it's the Western heartland that has by far the lowest levels of joblessness, as it has throughout the entire past 30-year period.
This is GDP growth in the three regions. Again, it is the Western heartland that sets the pace. It is the Western heartland that is growing the fastest, followed by the coastal states, and then lagged by the Eastern heartland, which is really, in some sense, the sick region of the United States. This shows the different growth of working population, and indeed, it shows you that it is, in fact, the Western heartland that has had the fastest growth in population, in working population over the last 30 years, followed by the coast, followed by the Eastern heartland, and the growth in per capita GDP has been fastest in the coastal states. Now, the last thing I want to say on this sort of pre-COVID job market is the change in American mobility, the change in American geographic dynamism. So these gaps in terms of economic success between a successful place like North Dakota and an unsuccessful place like Eastern Kentucky, these have always existed. And in many ways, these gaps were larger in the past than they have been today. In Mississippi in 1950 was the poorest state in the Union. In 1950, there were 17 states with per capita incomes that were at least twice as high as Mississippi. Flash forward to today, Mississippi is still the poorest state in the Union, but there is not a single state, there's not a single state with a per capita income that is twice that of Mississippi. So this is giving you a sense that the income gaps are not wider than they've been in the past, they're actually narrower. But what's different is that throughout almost all of American history, we have been a nation on the move, where the migration across space has enabled those income differences to disappear. And what you're seeing here is the decline in American mobility over the past 60 years. And this is the decline in geographic mobility. The red line shows movement across counties. The blue line shows overall movement. For 40 years prior to 1992, never fewer than 6% of Americans moved across counties. For the past 15 years, never more than 4% of Americans have moved across counties. That's a 1/3 drop in the movement of America. In some sense, it's a geographic sclerosis, a shutdown in a country on the move. And when we do see movement out of places like Eastern Kentucky, it's not necessarily helpful, right? So historically, you often had the poor move. Now, the people who leave out of these declining areas are the skilled, are the people who could provide leadership. And that's what you're seeing here. What you're seeing here is the college graduation rate among people who don't move and the college graduation rate among people who move. And as you can see, those places that are least skilled have the largest gap between the education of the stayers and the education of the movers. They really are exporting the talent that they have. This is related to a series of changes which suggest an America that's increasingly frozen in space. So migration, increasingly migration of the less skilled, is not directed towards high-wage areas. So in some sense, the big difference is, if I think about 200 years ago, when farmers left the rocky soil of New England to go to the area around Cincinnati, to go to the rich Ohio River Valley, they moved from an area that was poor to an area that was rich. In the 19th century, they left the farms of the South or the farms of the Midwest to come to cities like Chicago or Atlanta, where wages were considerably higher. In the 1930s and 1920s, farmers left Oklahoma to come to California. Always this movement from poor places to rich places. That has stopped. If you look at the past 40 years, we no longer see less skilled migrants move to rich places, partially because successful places zone out new growth. Places like San Francisco or New York or Boston have enacted housing market regulations that make it impossible to build homes that could possibly be affordable to ordinary people. This has led some economists, Chiang Kai-shek and Enrico Moretti, argue that these policies that artificially restrict the growth of these highly productive places have led to a substantial reduction in American GDP. You see places that start out with a skill gap, with a skill advantage, only get more skilled over time, and income convergence. The fact that skilled places, the fact that rich places have their income growth that is less than poor places, the fact that poor places catch up, that has really completely disappeared. And you can see this is income convergence. It's really stalled. There's no real line there. And if you look at persistence of not working rates, along the x-axis, along the horizontal axis here is the not working rate in 1980. Along the vertical axis is the not working rate in 2010. And as you can see, not only is there enormous persistence, there is a coefficient of more than 1, meaning that the thing seems like it's exploding. And this is really a world in which American spatial differences sort of start to loom very large. Where this left me before COVID was not in a world in which I was ever comfortable taxing the citizens of the productive parts of America to try to induce people to move to less productive areas. I don't think that North Dakota should pay for its success with higher taxes, which are then used to subsidize West Virginia. Nor do I think Boston should pay higher taxes to induce people to move somewhere else. But I do think we want different policies in different parts of the country. Policies that artificially subsidize the creation of low-income housing, like the low-income housing tax credit, are perfectly sensible in places like Boston or San Francisco. They make no sense in Detroit, which has a hangover of extra housing from its mid-century decades of success. It makes no sense in Houston or Dallas or any place where the private sector does an extraordinarily good job of building housing on its own. Similarly, we want employment policies that are targeted for the nature of the labor market, right? It is one thing for Seattle to enact a $15 minimum wage, right? Seattle's job market is booming. There have been many studies on this. Few are able to find a huge effect. Does anyone think that a $15 minimum wage would be remotely sensible in West Virginia? Does anyone think it would be plausibly a reasonable thing to do to try and ensure that companies have to hit some basically unmeetable barrier in places that already have a massive joblessness problem? Similarly, I think we may want to think about reforming the social safety net in a way that makes it more geographically tied to local conditions. Our disability system, for example, is the primary form of aid to non-working men. And that disability system imposes a fearsome tax on working, right? If you go over your earnings cap, you basically lose disability. There is good economic work by Magnus Mogstad at the University of Chicago that shows that when Norway enabled its disabled recipients to keep more of their earnings, they did earn more, they worked more, and they were better off as a result of it. There's no reason to not think about these types of reforms in a way that enables targeting of reforms into the places where it'll make the most good. If you wanted to have a subsidy for job creation, again, it would make sense to target that subsidy towards the parts of America that have the longest and most dire problems with persistent joblessness. Okay, now that was all pre-COVID-19. And in some sense, the success of urban America pre-COVID-19 all reflected the ability of cities to enable, or reflected the ability of some places to enable people to work together, to connect with one another. All of that came crashing down in the light of a pandemic that really ravaged our urban world and really challenged the model of the cities on the coast, as well as the cities in North Dakota, which, as we know, has been the epicenter of COVID in recent weeks. Now, we have had a long history of urban plagues. This is an image by Nicolas Poussin, the Baroque painter, of a biblical plague. But it is often used to capture the plague of Athens, which is our first well-described historical plague. The plague of Athens came in 430 BC, and the backstory for this was, of course, that Athens, in some sense, did everything that you would hope a city to possibly do. It enabled these collaborative chains of creativity that gave us the birth of philosophy, gave us the birth of history, gave us democracy, gave us triumphs in the arts, gave us remarkable things that happened because smart people learned from one another, because smart people copied from one another, and it really set the tone for all of the urban innovations that would follow after. But it also set the tone for the plagues that would come in. And the backstory for the plague itself was that Pericles had launched a war against Sparta. And Pericles' strategy was that they should fight the Spartans, who had an advantage on land, by sheltering within the walls of Athens and then sending out the superior Athenian fleet to harass the Spartan coast, thereby essentially protecting from a place of safety and doing great damage to the Spartans. Perfectly sensible strategy militarily, but while the Athenian walls were perfectly effective at keeping out the Spartan soldiers, they were completely ineffective at keeping out the virus that came in through the port of Piraeus. Cities are nodes on the great global transportation network, then as now, which means that they are the ports of entry for new diseases. And of course, urban proximity speeds the flow of the disease within the city as well. And that's exactly what happened in Athens. Thucydides, one of the two fathers of history, was there to describe it. And he describes a city that basically goes amok, that goes crazy. A quarter of the population dies within a short couple of years. Athens' golden age is essentially ended in this terrible plague. And it takes another 20 years for the Athenians to lose their war against Sparta, but lose it indeed they do. And it seems likely that without the plague, they would have succeeded. This is far from the most terrible of urban pandemics. The worst probably belongs to the plague of Justinian that came to Constantinople in 541 AD, where that emperor was proceeding to reimpose the Pax Romana on the Mediterranean world. He was sending out his great warlord Belisarius to impose peace and order on the Italian peninsula when the plague strikes. And in this case, we actually know it was Yersinia pestis, the first arrival of the bubonic plague on European shores, and it ravages Constantinople and it ravages all of Europe for another 2 centuries. And because in some sense, the future of Europe already hinged, they were in a weak place to withstand this plague, and it really serves to plunge Europe into 8 centuries of darkness. And that's exactly what follows from this. It really is sort of the most dire prediction. Now, for the last 700 years, plague reappeared in the 14th century, but since then, our urban world has proved reasonably resilient to it, as I indeed think it will be resilient to COVID-19. For most of the past 700 years, death and urbanism went together. Death and density went together. Now, there are always these terrible downsides of human concentration. There's traffic congestion, there's high housing costs, often crime is higher. But the most terrible of the demons of density has always been contagious disease. A boy born in New York City in 1900 could expect to live 6 years less than a boy born in rural America. That's about the same life expectancy gap that existed between Shakespeare's London and the rest of England. And here you can see the death rates in New York over the past 200 years, where plague after plague, first yellow fever in the first decades of the 19th century, and then cholera in the middle decades, came and really devastated the city. These were really the fruits of a first age of globalization. Yellow fever comes probably originally from Africa and then is carried up to the cities of the Northeast from the Caribbean. Cholera emerges in India in 1817, possibly in a mutation of a disease that had been endemic in there beforehand, and then travels throughout the trade routes that were growing, carried by the ships of the British East India Company and overland through Russia and eventually probably through Ireland to New York. Devastating decade after decade. And you needed both enormous investments and incentives as well as investments. So you can see here the Croton Aqueduct was built here, and the Croton Aqueduct is sort of symbolic of New York's commitment to sewers and clean water. America's cities and towns were spending as much on water at the start of the 20th century as our federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. Enormous amount of money that was spent fighting disease. And I suspect going forward, to make sure that this COVID pandemic never happens again, we will also have to reinforce our financial commitment to fighting contagious diseases in the 21st century. But it's not just about spending on health, it's also about incentives that go along with that. You will notice that while the Croton Aqueduct opens in 1842, New York continues to have cholera outbreaks for 25 years after the cholera epidemic, after the aqueduct opens. And the reason for that is the last mile problem that we still suffer from in the developing world today. It costs money to connect. Poor New Yorkers chose not to pay for those connections, and they continued to use their shallow wells, they continued to use their boreholes, and they continue to die. It's only after 1866 where the Board of Health starts imposing penalties on the owners of apartments, the owners of tenements who don't connect, that you actually have poor people connect on this. Can I just ask you, is my volume sounding okay? Is voice sounding okay? Okay, great. So let's flip to COVID-19. In the early years, it was very strongly associated with density. So this is a picture as of about May. And this is normal in pandemics. It's the same thing that happened in 1919 with the influenza pandemic. The epidemic comes in and it first hits the urban world, and then it moves to lower density America. And for most of the past 2 months, it's been disproportionately a low density thing, which reminds us that COVID does not need high densities to spread, but it does need personal contact. This shows the same thing that's happening in the developing world. This is results in favelas. Favelas are high density informal settlements in Brazil. Again, a strong positive correlation in the early months. And these are results with slums in India. The Indian work, we have some remarkable work on India, which has actually involved serological work, looking at the disease prevalence among asymptomatic individuals, meaning we have a pretty good idea as to what fraction of people have actually gotten the disease. Some of the larger slums in India, more than 50% of people have actually already caught it. So those areas are actually coming fairly close to herd immunity. It spread sufficiently quickly. In those areas, they were basically not able to react. They didn't have a way of living that wasn't on top of each other. In the West, we reacted by essentially de-urbanizing our world in a second. So cities, in a sense, are the absence of physical space between people. Cities at their heart are density, proximity, closeness. The opposite of urbanity is social distancing, is being physically apart from one another. And yet we did that on a dime. This shows our cell phone data from 5 different countries on the share of people who visited transit stations. And as you can see, about the end of March 2020, you suddenly had a 60% drop in the share of people visiting transit stations. In most of the world, the Italian gap happened first. This is true looking at almost any form of mobility. We immediately stopped. And it really wasn't, I mean, this is often depicted as being the fruit of the lockdown policies. In fact, much of urban America shut down before you had any lockdown policies. You actually didn't need the lockdown policies at all. People stopped going. And they were right to, because in fact, the mobility was strongly associated with catching the disease in those early months. And I should stress that this is from the months of April and May. This is before we had mask wearing, before we had other protocols. So I don't know the extent to which these results will reproduce, but this work comes from work of mine with Caitlin Gorbach and Stephen Redding. These are the 5 boroughs of New York. And I'll just, for those of you who didn't grow up in the city as I did, I'll just remind you of what these boroughs are. This long sliver here is Manhattan. This is the area with the tallest buildings and the most population density. Here is the island of Staten Island, the lowest density area, and its area that's sort of at the lower end of income. This is the inner area of Brooklyn, again, rich and fairly dense. Up here is the Bronx, and out here is Queens. Okay, and in general, as you get away from this core, things get less dense in terms of population. Okay, now what's really interesting is let's look at the map of COVID cases. Where are the COVID cases highest, where the density is highest. Okay, so it's not as if within this dense city, you had the most cases where people live in tall buildings. Instead, you had the most cases in Staten Island, in the Bronx, in the outer areas of Queens. Why? Because of the behavioral response. And indeed, a disease always is shaped by how people react to it. In these dense inner areas, they knew that they were at risk and they reacted accordingly, which means they stopped moving about. And using data both from cell phone records and from use of public transit, we see exactly the same thing. These inner areas really collapsed their mobility and they had fewer cases as a result. Our work suggests that a 10% reduction in trips was associated with a 20% reduction in disease during this time period. This is just the cross-sectional variation on this. We have a bunch of different, more clever statistical techniques which use the existence of people in either essential industries or industries that were unable to telecommute to predict which areas moved more. And indeed, it's worthwhile emphasizing, these are also the richer areas. So those are the areas which had more educated workers that were lucky enough to be able to convert themselves to working remotely. Now, this is not just a health crisis for our country, it is also an economic crisis. And it is an economic crisis that we have not yet really figured out the reckoning of it. 15% unemployment rate, which we reached in April 2020, is a level that we really haven't seen since the Great Depression. I mean, it's a different level of joblessness. And in some sense, the whole evolution of our economy from farm to factory to urban service worker has produced extreme pandemic vulnerability. So if you go back to the Black Death, to that era of Yersinia pestis, plagues, in fact, were an economic boom for those people who were lucky enough to survive them. Because wealth in a subsistence agriculture economy is basically determined by the number of land divided by the amount of land divided by the number of people. And if you eliminate the number of people, then you have much more land and consequently much more wealth. And so the 1/3 drop in Europe's population, as terrible and as tragic as it was followed by an economic boom rather than the reverse. In fact, it was an economic boom that probably encouraged the urbanization of the Renaissance. During our era of high industrialization, during the factories, working in the factory itself was at risk. And indeed, many factories shut down during the influenza pandemic of 1919 for that reason. But you could still ship the goods that you had already made. You could still buy goods with safety because buying a manufactured good does not typically carry risk. And so the basic economic model of making goods and shipping them got to persist. And these recessions, the recession that was associated with 1919 was quite short-lived. But switch forward to today, to our model of urban service workers. this is a world in which for millions and millions of American workers, 32 million Americans, 1/5 of the labor force works in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade. These jobs were a safe haven from automation and outsourcing because the ability to serve a latte with a smile was something that a knowledge worker was willing to pay for. And so millions and millions of Americans were able to find work because someone was willing to pay for them to deliver that service in person. Now, when that smile becomes a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure, then those jobs can disappear in a heartbeat, because for almost all of these things, you can make the coffee yourself at home. And that's exactly what happened. And together with and this just shows the path of employment. This is the rise in leisure and hospitality. This is retail trade, which has been flat. These are the two things together, which give you 32 million workers. This blue line is the decline of American manufacturing. So it's not that American manufacturing isn't healthy. It is healthy. It's a vibrant part of our economy, but it just doesn't involve that many people. Our most productive forms of manufacturing are very capital intensive. And so the growing areas, one part of these areas, so this is our most vulnerable sector. This orange sector is professional and business services. This is the sector that is still zooming their way towards employment. They might be a little bit less productive, but they are still employed. This is education and health services. So these are workers who often are in danger because they're from the health shock, but typically because their jobs are paid for by the public sector, they still find employment. But it's this middle sector that is at the most risk. And you can see this this comes from data on small businesses that a series of co-authors, Miriam Bertrand, Alex Bardick, Zoe Cullen, Mike Luca, and Chris Stanton and I did using the alignable network of small businesses. This involves millions of small businesses that are part of this network, and they regularly poll them. We did a bunch of work to show that this was relatively representative. We had a closure rate, you can really see this, as of April, about 45% of the firms in our sample said that they were closed. And I think even more worrisomely, in that sample, 37% of them expected to be still closed in December. A huge gulf between different industries. You can see personal services that includes, doing manicures or doing a massage, 86% closed. Restaurants, I think it's 56% closed. Arts and entertainment, 70% closed. By contrast, you have banking and finance, only 19% closed. Construction, only 32% closed. Professional services, only 21% closed. So a really big difference. In the short run, many of these firms were able to survive because of the extraordinary generosity of the Paycheck Protection Program. I kind of remember when giving away $600 billion seemed like it was actually a big deal. But somewhat amazingly, Congress just did that on a heartbeat in a program that was, quite honestly, very poorly directed and was just basically a huge dump of cash to whoever was lucky enough to sort of be in its direct line. There still are sort of fascinating things about why some parts of the country got so much more Paycheck Protection Program money than others did. But there's no question that it provided a lifeline for small businesses. But many of these businesses will close. Many of them already have closed and will close permanently. It is usually a fool's errand to think that you can save every business in a shock like this. The key is enabling the businesses to restart once the health pandemic is over. And in many parts of America, we have a web of business regulations that basically make that impossible. And I think in some sense, the lowest hanging fruit is to make sure that we have easy permitting for businesses to actually reopen after the shock. Now, the last thing I want to say something about is one of the things that happened, of course, as a result of COVID is many of us learned how to work from our home offices. This just shows the massive reduction in the share of people going to work, about 50% down in the US and a bunch of different countries. Massive change. And as of May 2020, about 50 million Americans were working remotely. About 50 million Americans had lost their jobs because of COVID, and about 50 million Americans were working remotely, which has led a number of people to predict that this change in remote working will be permanent. And indeed, all of our cities, all of our high density locations, in fact, all of our universities, which have traditionally thrived on face-to-face contact, they will become irrelevant because of the ability to Zoom our way to talks. Now, I will say personally, this lecture has already illustrated some of the shortcomings on this, because when the power goes out and you're remote, you cease to be able to communicate. But on top of that, this is much less fun and much less exciting than it would be in face-to-face. So as much as I love being able to connect with you, it's really not as good. But I think you want to think about this as being a long-term dance between urban proximity and technologies. There are ages where the technologies are centripetal, meaning they bring us together. and ages in which technologies are centrifugal, in which they push us apart. So the 19th century was a great centripetal century in which technologies like streetcars and elevators and skyscrapers enabled cities to grow, enabled them to move up, enabled people to become close to one another. The 20th century, much of it was a centrifugal century, when automobiles, which were themselves created by cities, enabled people to leave cities, enabled a dispersal of population. And the container ship, the radio, the television, all of these enabled long distance living. And consequently, right, the cyberseers and the techno-prophets, people like Alvin Toffler writing in 1980, predicted that the new forms of information technology would do to the urban professions what this older generation of technologies had done to urban industry. So it's easy to forget now, but the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s was not automobile production in Detroit. It was garment production in New York City. It was sewing clothes on the island of Manhattan, right? This industry was clobbered by globalization during the 1960s. 500,000 jobs lost in a short number of years, really just totally destroyed by the decline in transportation costs, by the new technologies. And so why didn't these things, these were the hot information technologies of the 1980s, just to remind you, why didn't these things kill off face-to-face contact in the cities that enable that contact? And for most of my life, I have been writing about why it is that cities are proving, will prove resilient in the face of these new technologies. And there are many pieces of this, and these are just two images of the value of face-to-face contact in a teched up time. This is an image of the Wallace office at Michael Bloomberg's City Hall, which is based on the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP, which is based on the Salomon Brothers trading floor, which Mike Bloomberg once ran. And this is the Google campus. And when you think about it, if of all the companies in all the world that should have been comfortable sending people home pre-COVID, it should have been Google. And yet that was the last thing that they did. They bought the Googleplex. They bought 1.5 million square feet in downtown Manhattan because they believed very strongly that creativity comes from human interactions. They believe that people get smart by being around other smart people, that cities are not just places that make us productive in a narrow way, but they create these chains of creativity that really sort of can make their company and can make our world really run. And that certainly was the belief of these areas. In some sense, and the prediction was that new technologies would make face-to-face contact obsolete, but the opposite seemed to be happening, because the more complicated a world became, the more valuable it became to be smart. And we get smart by hanging around other smart people. The more complicated the world is, the easier it is for complex ideas to get lost in translation, right? And we have all these cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are transmitted when we're in person, but are lost when we're connecting with each other in cyberspace. And I think, of course, it would also be a mistake not to remember that one of the reasons why cities have survived is that they are places of pleasure as well as productivity, that connecting in cyberspace will never compare with sharing a meal or a kiss or a smile. And I think ultimately, when you think about the long-run resilience of our urban spaces, it's going to come about as a result of cities as places of pleasure rather than cities as places of productivity. Okay, let me give you 3 facts on teleworking, and then I'll wrap up. This comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. 50 million American workers unable to work, 50 million who are teleworking. These numbers are a little bit lower than that because it's restricted to people over the age of 25. This shows the breakdown by schooling. As you can see, lost their job. Not much of a correlation with education until you get to the really high levels, and then fewer educated people lost their jobs. So about 13.7% as people with advanced degrees, as opposed to 20% of people with a high school diploma. By contrast, look at these teleworking shares. What share of people without a high school degree were teleworking in May? 5.2%. What share of people with an advanced degree were teleworking? 69%. Okay, that is a massive gap. This, like so many of the technologies that have come along, is not in any sense an equitable technology. This is a technology that favors the skilled massively. And so while it is certainly possible to imagine management consultants doing their job via Zoom, how can the 32 million Americans who work in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade, what happens to their jobs? Which means if we move to a virtual world, we move to a world in which we have excluded a vast chunk of the American economy, a vast chunk of America, which in some sense, if we went back to this graph at the beginning of this thing, this graph right over here, with which I began this talk, the Geographic of Not Working America. As I thought in 2019, as I imagined the future of America, I basically thought that any place there was a city, there would be a possibility for urban service jobs for less skilled workers. I had in mind that whatever was going on right now, the future of work would not disappear because some smart entrepreneur would figure out how to find a job for a scrappy kid growing up in a poor urban neighborhood. But I had no idea. I had no idea what kids without an MIT degree were going to do in West Virginia going forward. I just no idea what that job would look like. In some sense, what COVID-19 does is it turns all of America into West Virginia because it eliminates those possibilities for having those face-to-face jobs. Second fact, what do the businesses say? So as part of our polling, we asked business leaders what they thought their probability was of what share of their workers who switched to remote would stay remote. We did this with the Alignable Network, and those businesses are small, and we did this with a poll of the National Association of Business Economists, a somewhat smaller switch. Both answers give us that about 40%, slightly less in the NABE sample, slightly more in the Alignable sample, 40% of businesses said that 40% or more of their workers that switched would stay switched. So if you think 50 million Americans worked, 40% of 40% works out to something like 8 million Americans switching. So that's a pretty big number, but it's not everybody, okay? Last fact, and I think this fact is quite neat. This is from a student of mine, Jose Ramon Morales Aria and Des Moines, showing you, this shows jobs that Dingle and Naiman classify as being not remotable. This shows jobs that are remotable. The red line is employment. The blue line is postings on Burning Glass. So these are job postings, okay? So what happens to the two types of jobs? Non-remotable jobs. So these are jobs that you've got to be there in person. Employment drops, so do postings. But look what happened. Employment came back somewhat. It's still depressed. Postings came back, okay? We're back out where we were pre-pandemic in terms of postings. What about remotable jobs? Employment much more steady. Postings cratered. Postings stayed cratered, okay? So what does that mean? Well, there's a reasonable hypothesis that in fact, these remote jobs can survive because we've known each other ex ante, because we formed relationships before COVID, before we knew each other. And you can't necessarily bring someone in, teach them the culture, connect them, get them to feel about the job that it's more than a transaction if all they've ever done is seen you over Zoom, if all they've ever been is part of the corporate team over Zoom. I will say as a teacher, right, I may know how to transfer information via Zoom, but I have no idea how to get 19-year-olds excited about mathematical economics over Zoom. I just think it's an enormously hard thing to do. And that's in some sense the challenge that every corporate CEO has, is they're trying to get their workers to view this job as more than just a paycheck, but as something that they want to do something special for. And I think that's increasingly difficult with new employees in a world of Zoom. So let me dust out my crystal ball for what it's worth. I think that if we don't get distribution of the vaccines, or if they prove to be unsuccessful in 2021, if we have this disease kick around until 2022, 2023, and if perhaps we have another pandemic within the next decade, I think we're in for a pretty terrible time, okay? And it's a terrible time not just for cities, but for every part of the country, every part of the economy that relies upon face-to-face connection, right? Fargo will suffer just as much as Seattle does and Boston does, and especially anyone who labors in an urban service industry. I believe that the harm of that, the pain of that, will be such that we will actually be smart enough to make the medical investments, make the investments in preventing contagious diseases to make sure that this never happens again. If this does end quickly, if we get those vaccines out, if we do make those investments that make sure that, like the pandemic of 1919, it's a once in a century event, then urban life will come back, but there will still be major short run shocks, particularly for our urban areas. Prices will be down in rich cities, especially for commercial space, because 8 million workers or so are going to switch to remote working. That doesn't mean that those offices will be vacant, right? Real estate developers are perfectly capable of cutting rents. It just take them a while. So our cities will become cheaper. There will be a conversion from commercial to residential. At least if I'm right, that the thing that will be a bulwark of cities is the demand for cities as places of play rather than places of productivity. I think I feel somewhat safe in that production because one thing is that we've noticed is that when the lockdown policies ended, right, when it became possible to go out again to bars and restaurants, young people rushed. right? They rushed perhaps too much, but they rushed because they hungered to be with other young people. They rushed to get their lives going again. That hunger to be with other human beings, which is particularly true among younger and single people, that is likely to repower the demand for face-to-face contact and repower the demand for cities. That predicts that cities will be reallocating from old to young. And some significant work is likely to move either to homes or to lower density locales. If you think that there will be, as I guess I do, some portion of footloose, high education workers who are able to relocate their jobs anywhere, this will be very good for medium density cities with high levels of consumer amenities, high levels of attractiveness. Think Vail, think Boulder, think Honolulu even. So in a world in which you are thinking about your region as being competitive, you want to think about what makes your region more competitive to talent as a place for people to live rather than as a place for people to work. And of course, finally, international travel, we surely depressed for quite some time, and this is going to be a big problem for cities that depend upon tourist dollars. On top of this, public transit is under enormous stress. Local budgets are under enormous stress. It's going to be a tough 5 years. I do not think that it's going to be as tough as the 1970s, which were really an awful decade for cities, but it's certainly, even in the best case scenario, this is going to be a challenging time for our urban spaces. And partially because they were in trouble before this started, partially because they had moved from a pragmatic consensus, which is where we had been in 2001, where our cities were hit with the threat of terrorism, to a world of conflict, to a world of anger, to a world of fractiousness. And it's important, both in cities and in places, to remember that the right policies are ones that grow the pie for everyone, not that are simply about robbing from Peter to pay Paul. And I think it is really important when we think about all of our local geographies to be focused on those policies that encourage education, encourage entrepreneurship, encourage and empower smart people, and then get out of their way. And with that, I will end and open up for questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed. That was a really great presentation. A lot of insight, a lot of questions in my mind. I mean, I think it's going to spark a lot of questions. I know it has already. And I want to compliment you on how you handled the technological glitch. We actually received a lot of comments from people complimenting you on how you handled it. So that was excellent.
Sadly, it's not the first time, John.
I could see myself panicking in that situation. I don't think I would have handled it that way. So great job. I want to ask the first question, I guess, and then I'll go to the audience questions. But one of the questions I'd like to ask is that I think the pandemic has put an increased spotlight on education for children. And particularly, a lot of people are concerned with the lack of face-to-face education and the disparities in education. I think this is revealing, one, that this has we know it has a big impact on children's future, but there's also a concern that there's widening disparities, that some people get good educations, others not as good. And people that are at a disadvantage, this could actually put them at a bigger disadvantage in the future. And one of the things that you talk about in some of your research is that a good way for cities to attract people, and you just alluded to it a couple of minutes ago, is to have high quality education. And you've talked about things like having school choice or paying teachers for performance. And so I'm wondering, do you think with the increased spotlight right now on education that this might be the time when we could reach a general consensus on a need to reform our education system, introducing things like, vouchers and having pay for performance for teachers?
I think it is always a good time to be making a case for school reform. I think this is exactly right. It's been a catastrophic year for children's learning, and it is a catastrophic year that will particularly hit the poorest kids who don't have access to parents who are able to move mountains to make things easier for them. So I hope that you're exactly right. I must admit, I've been on the edges of school reform for 20 years. I was on the advisory panel for the Gates Foundation's domestic branch, which focuses on their school reform efforts. It is amazing how tough a fight it is. And I think part of the problem is it is just very, very hard to get to anything that does not include the teachers union at the bargaining table in a major way. And, I continue to think that individual teachers are heroes, but particularly in tough performing urban city school districts. But the union puts the interests of all of their teachers, good as well as bad ones, ahead of the interests of kids a lot of the time. And I think that, we saw this during the pandemic as well, where the California Teachers Union seemed to be taking the view that it was an imposition to require teachers to actually do their Zoom teaching live, that they had to have the right to pre-record their Zoom teaching, which I cannot imagine a worse experience for an 11-year-old than a pre-recorded Zoom thing with a teacher. So this really is a vital moment for school reform, and it's just a very hard one. This is an area which, if you want to understand why the Western Heartland is a success story, I think it really is the fact that the Western Heartland is the birthplace of the American high school movement. It is really the place which, because of a variety of things, education came first in this region, that farm wealth, the wealth of the farm, the wealth of the soil was turned into schools. And that really is central to their success. But, John, let's fight the good fight on this. I mean, it's always worthwhile fighting on this. And in some sense, I would just say one thing on urban schools. The fact that our urban schools perform poorly, and this really has come forward in the data that my colleague Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren and John Friedman has put forward, that they both, this is data on upward mobility. You look at the income of parents, and then you connect them with the kids 30 years later, and you see how well the kids do. The Western Heartland looks very, very good on this. North Dakota looks very good on this. Our schools, our urban schools, our central city school districts look very poorly on this. There's sort of a big jump in upward mobility just when you get to the other side of the central city school district, unsurprisingly. And our cities in general look poor on this. And in some sense, it's an indictment of our urban spaces. And it doesn't have to be this way. No Englishmen ever thought they had to leave London to get better schools for their kids. No Frenchmen ever thought they had to leave Paris. It's precisely America's failure. And I sometimes use the metaphor that it's sort of like all of the urban virtues of innovation and competition are turned off when we have a single public school district. It's almost like saying, let's take all those urban restaurants, which do such a great job of making, fun, often inexpensive food, and we're going to replace it with a single public canteen, right? And we're going to ask it, how much are you going to like eating in New York if the food is delivered by a single public canteen? And the odds are you'd hate it, but that's exactly what we've done with our school systems.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to let the people in the audience know that we will go beyond 4 o'clock. So, so please stay with us if you're able to. You can leave at 4, of course, if you have to. So the first question says, North Dakota has persistent problems with attracting and maintaining the workforce needed for the industry and the promotion of economic growth. How do you think this may be influenced by the pandemic?
Well, I think look, we all know that, there's no variable that better predicts population growth in the 20th century than January temperature, right? There are many things rolled up in this. And will say, as a New Englander, I think it shows a lack of character on the part of our country. But that being said, it is a fact. It is a fact that both Massachusetts and North Dakota struggle with. So, that's a heavy burden to bear. And I think the best that can be counted on is focus on what amenities will attract people to North Dakota. I think schooling is a great place to start, making sure that everyone understands that if you want your kids to be smart, if you want your kids to be successful, North Dakota is a strong possibility. But then also making sure that it's as easy as possible to start a fun ethnic restaurant or to do whatever else would sort of make the place more exciting. Just make sure there aren't barriers to that opening, right? I think it's very hard for local governments to engineer fun on their own, but they can stop it. So let's just make sure that we're not stopping it any more than we can.
Thank you. Great. The next one is, do you think teleworking will have an impact on traditionally high salary, high cost of living way of life in places like the Silicon Valley? And will those companies look to move toward more teleworking so that they can employ workers around the country and pay them less?
You bet. Absolutely. I think it's unlikely to be that the workers are totally dispersed. So I think, again, for the reasons that I alluded to, sort of having everyone off in 8 million different places is probably not ideal, but you can certainly manage better a remote working cluster in Austin, Texas, in Nashville, in Vail. So I think those are likely to be the winners. It's going to be places that probably already have an advantage in attracting high-skilled people, those places that are sort of high amenity locations. And those places, I think, are likely to continue to do well out of this. So it's probably a slight decline in demand for the most expensive high demand areas. And you're already seeing this, like rents in San Francisco are down for the first time in forever. But I would also, just to stress, I would not be expecting vast amounts of vacancies in San Francisco, right? What happens in high demand areas is the price goes down long before you have these places being empty. So it's not like San Francisco's population is suddenly going to vanish. It's just going to get a bit more affordable.
Okay, and so a thought that sparked the person, one of the people in the audience, a thought that they had during this is that population trends they thought that when you're talking about population trends for contagious disease spread, they've noticed that a large rural pushback has been against any response at all to the coronavirus. And so might the historical trend of high density areas suffering more from contagious diseases be the cause of low density areas treating COVID as trivial in comparison?
It's possible. I don't know. I mean, there also were interesting politics related to this, which was interesting as well. I mean, I will tell you, my view has always been that I have tended to be on the side of personal liberty combined with responsibility. That is always how I believe that one should live our lives, that we should live our lives without the government telling us what to do, but at the same time, we should be cautious and responsible. So I think that's the view that I've would tend to favor in the case of the disease as well, which is, a little bit less in terms of public mandate, but plenty of private responsibility on this. And somehow or other, we had combined during the COVID period, people who were against over government regulation, which I totally understand, combine that with a view, well, that means I don't have to take personal responsibility, whereas it sort of, I think, should go the other way.
Right. And so the next question is about the CARES Act, and I'm just going to combine it with my own question about this. What is that? One of the things that you talk about in your work is that we should help people, but not help places. And so one of the most contentious issues in any further COVID relief packages is, should we bail out cities and should we bail out states? And on the one hand, you could argue, well, their revenues are down because of the pandemic, so we should bail them out. But on the other hand, there's concerns that bailing them out may allow them to delay any kind of reforms that they should be taking, like, for example, unfunded pensions or any kind of fiscal mismanagement. And so I'm wondering, do you have thoughts on, should we, if we do pass another COVID relief package, should we bail out cities and states?
So I'm not going to be rigidly dogmatic about this, but my instinct is certainly in the spirit of the way the question was phrased, which is that fundamentally, we are in a healthier world in which cities and states plan for their own futures, in which they've set aside rainy day funds, expecting there to be troubles ahead. And when they face downturns, they borrow against their own future revenues. It seems vastly healthier to do that than to look to a world in which you regularly get yourself in trouble and then come running to Uncle Sam to ask for money. Now, there is an oddity in this country, and I'm not sure exactly why it is the case, that we feel very comfortable with the federal government racking up unbelievable amounts of debt and yet react in horror when our states and localities have any form of debt, which is an odd thing. So I think probably the right answer is that the Fed should borrow less and that the localities should borrow more. But given that we're in this world, I'm sort of okay with the idea that the federal government is going to, let's say, lend the localities a little bit. But I really think by and large, we're better off without thinking that we're going to tax people from some areas to give it to some other area. I think it was quite helpful for New York when Ford told the city to drop dead in the 1970s. He didn't literally say it, but I think it was quite helpful for New York to reform its fiscal situation in response to that. I think it would be fundamentally unhealthy if New York thought that it got a free pass on this. But a little bit of humanitarian aid, mainly just to make sure that the kids don't get shortchanged, that there aren't really drastic shortfalls in really high poverty communities. I think that's probably okay. But you really want to be careful with this. You really don't want to get in the habit of bailing out these cities. And indeed, there's very little. I mean, New York has had a fat decade, and there's been very little of planning for the future. I will also say, just on unfunded pension liabilities, which is a longstanding hobby horse of mine. Cities have life cycles just like ordinary people do. And for many cities, economic decline was in fact predictable. In 1970, it was pretty clear that the old manufacturing ways were on the way out, that Detroit could be expected to be smaller in the decades ahead. Now, when you're a human being and you expect your revenues to go down, you're supposed to be saving, facing the future, right? But by contrast, what they did is they borrowed. They racked up massive pension liabilities, which meant that they were spending during flush towns and leaving themselves poor during short times. And that's exactly the opposite of what they should have been doing.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that says that you noted that young people are more likely to flock to the cities. Do you think it will affect regulations of housing and zoning that make cities harder to live in currently before COVID-19?
You know, I hope so. Look, I mean, I will put this in a larger context. So there's a book by Manker Olson called The Rise and Decline of Nations that he wrote 40 years ago. That it tells a story of how countries that are stable for long periods of time get taken over by cliques of insiders, be they industry groups or labor groups or various groups that manage to figure out how to rig the system in order to punish outsiders. And he tells stories about Japan before the Meiji Restoration in the 18th century, or England in the 1970s before Thatcher. Yes, there we have it, alum of NDSU. So I'm glad to plug the great Manker Olson. Now, I will say when I read Olson in 1990, I sort of thought, this isn't America. America's a dynamic place. We're not closed to outsiders. But I would say over the last 30 years, it just feels like place after place, we have been, shutting out outsiders. And one of those is business regulations that make it harder to open new businesses. And you see this in the decline in the amount of business dynamism, new business creation. One part of it is the evolution of our government into something that's been not totally unfairly described as a pension system with an army attached. You see this in our housing policies, where we protect existing homeowners and make it impossible for new homes to be built for young people. I hope very, very strongly that young people who come to cities recognize that what they need to do is to fight for an opening up, to fight for a system in which that makes it easier for businesses to open, that makes it easier for buildings to be built. I worry that there's too little focus on growing the pie and too much on just taking what's there for me. That instead of saying, how do I make things better, you just want a forgiveness of student debt. Right. And that's not growing the pie. That's just cash for young people, which, you can say offsets the cash for old people. But the right idea is not to keep on fighting about redistribution for your interest group, is to actually have a set of rules that make everyone richer, and particularly that make things better for outsiders. And I think that's really what the hope is, that we get to a society that is more dynamic and more open through tearing down some of the old rules and by making sure that we invest more in those people who start with less.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to just put in a plug for, there's an interview of you in the Wall Street Journal in January where you address exactly that issue. And you talk about how hyper redistribution policies are attractive to the young because of the policies that benefit entrenched interests at the expense of people moving up. So again, I just ask people, if you're interested, just read that article as well. It's very interesting. There's also, the next question is, there's a push towards bringing broadband capacity to rural areas. So because of the pandemic, how do you see this push going forward?
I guess I'm more open than I was beforehand. So I previously was I'm always a little bit skeptical about, infrastructure miracle stories that somehow or other we're going to bring broadband to all parts of rural America and you're going to have Silicon Valleys on every street corner. That always felt a little far-fetched to me. I'd still want to see cost-benefit analysis. I should push anyone who's interested in this. My colleague at Harvard Business School, Shane Greenstein, is just fantastic on this. He has a series of articles on digital infrastructure that are really great, and I really push you towards Shane's work. I had not focused, and I don't think very many of us had focused before 2020 on how the absence of broadband would punish children during a period of pandemic. And I think the pandemic has made me more open to this, but I'd still want to see cost benefit analysis, as I think we should demand in the case of any large scale infrastructure investment.
Yeah, very good. Next question is, how can North Dakota establish a welcoming community for ethnic migration to help push economic development?
So I don't know that there's any particular secret on this. Certainly, if you look back to 100 years ago, North Dakota was one of the most immigrant-heavy parts of the country, right? So there was certainly a period, we were just looking at maps and that for a workshop I went to yesterday of the sort of history of immigrants in the West. And indeed, immigrants were sort of a crucial part of North Dakota's success. I mean, a very education-intensive, a Northern European wave that really sort of built institutions that have proved durable and effective. I think there's no reason why that can't be true going forward, but it may require a little work. Now, there are advocates, there are a couple of guys at AEI, I don't remember their names, who have been pushing for place-specific visas, where sort of local governments would serve as visa sponsors the same way as that companies do with H-1B visas. It's a little bit hard to figure out how that actually works. And certainly the ability to enforce, you can't really like force a person to live in a particular area. But I think certainly it's right to be focused on attracting talent, not just from within the United States, but globally as well. And there's no reason why. I mean, North Dakota has had such a great economic track record of the past 15 years that, there's no reason why it can't continue to be dynamic. And I think one thing that is great is sort of just making it clear that it's really easy to start your business here. That, and I just want to make it clear what that is, what I'm saying there. I'm not suggesting that, every town in North Dakota should set up boondoggle lending things where they offer to pay money to new businesses and open them up. This is not something that governments are good at. But they should make it clear that, look, you want to start your business in New York, you've got to get 17 permits from 17 different agencies and figure out a bunch of people who don't speak your language. We've got, a one-stop hotline. We will answer your questions. We'll get you an answer within a week. You don't even have to come here just to file your thing. And we'll manage to subcontract with someone through the virtual world who will speak your language, right? So you can actually move through something like that suggests that North Dakota is open for really rapid business permitting with anybody from anywhere in the world. Feels like that's a helpful policy to push on.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I hope that North Dakota policymakers are listening to this right now. The next question is, when businesses face forced closure from shutdowns, does the government have a responsibility to provide businesses with aid?
People, yes. Businesses, no. Okay. With businesses, you need to like figure out what the right policy is to avoid total disruption of everything. And I would probably have, if I were in Congress, I don't know what combination of economics and politics would push me to this. My guess is that I would have been, like everybody else, one of the people who would have cravenly signed the CARES Act. But I would have done so with grave misgivings because it is just such an enormous flow of money to particular industries. But there is no humanitarian reason why you have to bail out businesses at all. It's all got to be about what you think is going to happen in the absence of this to the overall function of the economy. What we needed to do was, and we did do some of this, and we should continue to do this, is we want to mitigate the human hardship of shutdowns. We want to mitigate the human hardship of people being locked down. And I will say, normally, I am quite hostile to things like universal basic income. So I think that, when you think about this rising joblessness, I think that paying everyone a check, regardless of what they worked, is likely to promote more joblessness. I think joblessness is misery. That is exactly what we saw from the negative income tax experiments in the 1970s, that you give people free money and there's some income elasticity of employment. And if you are less hungry, you're more likely to not work. That is not true during a period of COVID. I'm not worried about that during a period of COVID. I think we're fine with having a bunch of people who are discouraged from working during this time period. And so I think we should, in fact, be comfortable writing people checks to avoid hunger, to avoid starvation. And so I think that's where we want to be focused on, is this humanitarian aid is aid to people, not to businesses.
Yeah, great advice. So the next question talks about the cost of the bailouts. And so what is our ability to absorb the debt of the cost of any future bailouts?
I will leave that to my macroeconomist colleagues. It is just an extraordinary amount of money. It's just mind-boggling. Now, the one thing, saving grace, is remember, of course, this is all dollar-denominated debt, which means we own the printing press and we can always inflate our way out of it. That will not be free, but we will never actually have to default on this debt. But it is just an extraordinary amount of debt, and someone is going to have to pay the cost of it.
Yeah. So the modern monetary theory people, I guess they're much less concerned about it.
This is not real economics.
I agree. So the next question is, how will the pandemic impact future services for elderly populations, particularly in our retirement homes? Will older generation be less likely to retire, or will they be forced to retire?
I don't think anyone's going to be forced to retire, although it is certainly true that some people are choosing to retire early because of the disruptions of COVID. That has certainly happened, and that's likely to continue. I would say I was very uncertain in the early days of the pandemic. I still am, about what the appropriate lockdown policies were. I mean, it's a hard question. There are trade-offs on different sides. And so I'm not likely to point the finger on anyone on this thing. But I think there is one area in which we obviously 100% screwed up, and it was a screw up that was actually pretty predictable, which is the absolute human catastrophe that was what happened to our nursing homes. Okay, it is clear that our nursing homes were at risk. We saw this already from the Italian data. We knew the elderly were vulnerable, and yet we took almost no significant steps to protect them. We needed to lock them down, right? We needed to actually make sure that you did not have a flow of workers across nursing homes, which the work of Judy Chevalier and her colleagues has shown is strongly associated with this. We need to make sure we didn't have workers going in and out of the nursing homes to high-risk communities in the early days. We needed to lock them down. And if we needed to pay in Massachusetts, 60% of our deaths were in nursing homes. Okay, I mean, this is where the human Armageddon was. If we needed to pay our nursing home workers double time, triple time to get them to stay there and rather than going home, then for goodness sakes, we should have done that. That would have been millions relative to the trillions that we have spent in terms of the disruption from this. So, this was an area in which a small amount of money, $1 billion, which is nothing by the standards of anything we're talking about, could have handled basically all of this to make sure that our nursing homes were protected. So this is just an area in which we have to do better going forward. I think it's certainly true that many people will feel wary about going into nursing homes in the future if they have any choice. They will not seem like safe options for many parts of America with good reason. And I hope more families at least take seriously the fact that they are, their parents are precious people, and they should try to figure out how to care for them within the family. And I certainly hope that we do this going forward. I think this industry is going to be challenged as a result of this, but there still is going to be plenty of demand in the long run. But certainly that this is the greatest human catastrophe, and it was the greatest human catastrophe that really could have been stopped. Yeah, I agree. I mean, including admitting people infected with COVID into nursing homes. I mean, which I don't understand that at all. But anyway, so next question asks is, what do you think will happen? And I suppose it depends on your two scenarios at the end, but what do you think will happen to income inequality post-COVID-19? So there's the personal, and there's the political, and then there's the straight economic. So I think on its own, it's hard to see that this thing doesn't widen inequality. So the most hit, at least if you're talking about sort of the 90-10 differential, there may be some fortunes at the very highest level that are cut as a result of that. So that super high inequality may decline because there are maybe some people who are worth billions who may be worth slightly fewer billions as a result of this. But as you saw, for most of the sort of professional and business service workers, they're still zooming, they're still surviving. 70% of them are getting by. Poor Americans are working and either getting sick or losing their jobs. And so COVID itself was a highly unequal plague. The aftermath is likely to continue to be unequal because the jobs that are impacted most are going to be these urban service worker jobs. So all of that pushes inequality up. The force that goes in the other direction is the political force. And I don't know how this plays out. I mean, as we know, the politics ended up in a sort of centrist place with divisions of government, which tends to mean probably that we're not going to get some sort of a massive wave of redistribution after this. But like John, I mean, I think there's sort of good redistribution and there's bad redistribution in the sense that like a renewed commitment to making sure that we have good schools for our least fortunate kids is the kind of redistribution I want. The kind of redistribution I want is the kind of redistribution that makes sure that everyone has a shot at higher opportunity. The kind of redistribution that just randomly takes money from one group and gives it to another, depending upon who's loudest and most effective at organizing, that's something that I certainly am not as enthusiastic about. And unfortunately, in the maelstrom of politics, you're never sure which kind of redistribution you're going to end up with. Yeah, that's true. So can you speak a little bit about the urban, rural, social capital pre and post-COVID? There are, so by social capital, I mean, social capital has a long history. Henry James wrote about social capital in the 19th century when he described a woman's hair as her social capital, meaning the capital that she took into society. Bob Putnam, of course, made social capital into his topic in which he first argued that social connections across people were the source of political strength in Italy and then the US, and then argued that America was getting progressively less connected because we were all bowling alone. There are differences across space in this. Social capital tends to line up quite closely with other forms of human capital. So highly educated areas have more forms of social connection. And there are things that even surprise people, which is historically, at least, better educated people were much more likely to attend church, although they were less likely to believe in God, which was sort of an interesting paradox. Which partially is explained by the fact that both education and attending religious services involves sitting still, and if you're good at one, you're good at the other. So I don't know how this will change post-COVID. I know this has been a big challenge. I would expect that in terms of social connection, that the young people will do better at rekindling those connections than the old. I think actually there's sort of more fear of human connection among the old. And I would expect that it's not going to be so much rural urban divisions as across demographics, but I don't have a strong prediction on this. But it's a great question and a great question. I look forward to seeing it play out.
Okay, thank you. And so we're getting close to coming up on a time limit, but here's another question that just came in. So what do you think, if vaccines are successful and we get back to normal, the effect of the massive stimulus, direct and through the Fed work with banks through payment holidays for consumer loans, will be on inflation in the United States and the world as a whole?
Yeah, I expect some inflation. I think we should. I mean, borrowing like crazy should tend to yield generally positive expectations about how much money we're going to print in the future. So I would tend to think that inflation is a reasonable expectation on this. I don't know how catastrophic it's going to be. Again, I don't want to pretend to be a macroeconomist. I'm not one. So I think your expectation is a reasonable one, but I don't want to speak with any degree of assurity on it.
Okay, thank you. So the questions are moving all over the place on the screen I'm looking at. So I think we're out of time now, but thank you for doing this. Dr. Glaeser, really appreciate this. Could everyone please give a round of applause? And I know that you won't hear everyone else, but you can hear me. So give a virtual round of applause to Edward Glaeser. It was an excellent presentation. And I want to make sure to let everyone know that on January 19th, we have our next Menard Family Distinguished Speaker. It'll be J.D. Vance. So talking about the Hillbilly Elegy.
Oh, fun.
Movie just came out, so yeah, please join us for that. And Ed,
ask
you're willing
you about
to join
joblessness
us.
in the Eastern Heartland.
Yeah, exactly. When you said that at the beginning, I'm like, wow, that's very appropriate that you mentioned that. So yeah, if you want to attend, you can too. But anyway, thanks again for being here today. This is really great, and again, excellent job of adjusting to the technical difficulties, and it was very insightful, and we could go on and on with questions. I mean, because it's very fascinating, and it's a important issue, and I appreciate you researching these areas and the great insights that you gave to us as well. So thank you.
Thank you, John. It's really been a pleasure for me too.
Yeah. So thanks, and thanks again to everybody, the Menard family, and all of our donors. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.